You know, people often ask me how I managed to understand so many different things: physics, mathematics, biology, even safe cracking and bongo drums. They assume there must be some kind of trick to it, some natural talent I was born with. But that's not really true. The truth is much simpler, and perhaps more useful. I learned how to learn. And once you know how to learn, everything becomes possible. Let me tell you about something that happened when I was working at Los Alamos during the war. We had all these brilliant people, some of the greatest minds in physics, and we were all working on this enormous problem. One day, I was sitting in the cafeteria with some colleagues, and they were discussing a particular aspect of neutron diffusion. The conversation was full of complex equations and technical terms, and I noticed that while everyone was nodding along, I had this uncomfortable feeling that I didn't really understand what we were talking about. Not deeply, anyway. Now, I could have just stayed quiet and pretended to understand. That's what most people do. But I had learned something important years before, something my father taught me when I was just a boy. He taught me that knowing the name of something is not the same as knowing something, and that distinction changed everything for me. My father used to take me on walks in the Catskill Mountains. He wasn't a scientist, he was in the uniform business, but he had this wonderful way of looking at the world. We'd see a bird, and he'd say, "You see that bird? In German, it's called a Pfeilstorch. In Chinese, they call it a Chungling. In Japanese, a Katakataka. You can know all those names in every language in the world, but when you're done, you'll know absolutely nothing about the bird. You'll only know about people in different places and what they call a bird." Now, he'd say, "That bird is a brown-throated thrush, and it's singing because it's defending its territory or attracting a mate. When it moves like that, it's looking for insects. That's beginning to know something." This lesson stuck with me, really stuck, because I realized that most of what we call knowledge is actually just familiarity with labels. We mistake the map for the territory. We think because we can name something, we understand it. But understanding is something else entirely. So back to that cafeteria at Los Alamos. When I felt that uncomfortable sensation of not really understanding, I did what I always do. I went back to my room, took out some paper, and I started to work through the problem myself. Not by memorizing what the others had said, but by trying to explain it to myself from scratch, as if I were teaching it to someone who knew nothing about physics. I wrote, "Okay, what is neutron diffusion really about? What's actually happening?" And then I tried to explain it in the simplest possible terms. Not using the fancy equations first, those would come later, but using plain language. I imagined I was explaining it to someone like my father, someone intelligent but without technical training. And here's what happened. I got stuck. I couldn't explain it simply because I didn't understand it well enough. There were gaps in my knowledge that I had been papering over with technical jargon. So I went back to the basic principles. I looked at what I did understand solidly, and I built up from there, piece by piece, always checking. Can I explain this simply? Does this make sense? When I finally could explain it in simple terms, something magical happened. I understood it better than I had before, much better. And more than that, I could see connections to other things I knew. I could see where the equations came from, what they really meant, why they had to be that way and not some other way. This became my method. Whenever I needed to learn something, anything, I would follow this same process. I'd take a blank piece of paper and I'd write at the top, "What is?" And then whatever concept I was trying to understand. Then I'd try to explain it as if I were teaching it to someone bright but completely unfamiliar with the subject. The key is that you can't fool yourself when you do this. You can fool yourself in a lot of ways. You can memorize equations. You can learn to manipulate symbols. You can even get the right answers on tests. But when you try to explain something in plain language, the truth comes out. If you can't explain it simply, you don't really understand it. And let me be clear about what I mean by simply. I don't mean dumbing it down or being imprecise. I mean stripping away the unnecessary complexity, the jargon that we use to hide our lack of understanding. Einstein once said something about this, that you should be able to explain your theory to a barmaid. People laughed at that, but he was right. If you truly understand something, you can explain it in everyday language. The complexity should be in the idea itself, not in the words you use to describe it. I remember when I was trying to understand quantum electrodynamics after the war. This was a field in crisis. The theory made ridiculous predictions, infinities everywhere. People were stuck. I was stuck too, at first. I knew the mathematical machinery, sure, but I didn't really understand what was happening physically. So I started over. I got a notebook and I began to explain it to myself from the beginning. An electron moves from point A to point B. What really happens? I drew pictures, simple pictures, little arrows and lines. I didn't start with the Lagrangian formalism or the canonical approach. I started with, what is the simplest way to think about this? And you know what I discovered? All that fancy machinery that everyone was using, it was obscuring something much simpler underneath. By forcing myself to explain it simply, by using these little pictures I drew, I found a different way to do the calculations, a way that made sense to me physically. Those simple pictures eventually became what people call Feynman diagrams, and they helped solve some of the problems that had everyone confused. But here's what I want you to understand. The diagrams weren't the point. The point was the process of simplification, of explanation, of getting down to what's really happening. The diagrams were just a tool that came out of trying to understand clearly. Now, you might think this approach would be slow, and in one sense it is. It takes longer to really understand something this way than to just memorize formulas or to accept what authorities tell you. But in another sense, it's much faster. Because when you truly understand something, when you can explain it simply and clearly, you never forget it. It becomes part of how you think, and you can use it to understand new things. Because you're not just carrying around a bag of disconnected facts and formulas. You're carrying around principles that you understand deeply. I saw this when I taught at Caltech. Students would come to my office hours, frustrated because they couldn't solve a problem. They'd show me pages of equations they'd written. Look, they'd say, I know the formula, I know what I'm supposed to do, but I can't get the answer. And I'd ask them, what's the problem about? Physically, what's happening? Often, they couldn't tell me. They could write down the equation for conservation of energy, but they couldn't explain what energy conservation actually means. They could manipulate the symbols, but they didn't understand what the symbols represented. So I'd say, forget the equations for a moment. Tell me in words what's happening in this problem, and we'd talk through it. A ball is rolling down a hill. What does that mean? It means it's losing potential energy. Where does that energy go? Into kinetic energy, into movement. How much? Well, it depends on the height of the hill and the mass of the ball. Once they understood it that way, the equations weren't mysterious anymore. The equations were just a precise way of writing down what they already understood. They became tools instead of obstacles. This is what I mean by learning. Not memorization, not symbol manipulation. Understanding. There's another part to this, though. Something equally important. When you explain something to yourself this way, you discover what you don't know. You find the boundaries of your understanding, and that's incredibly valuable. Most people avoid these boundaries. They stay in the safe zone of what they already know, or they pretend the boundaries aren't there. But the boundaries are where all the interesting stuff is. That's where learning happens. That's where the adventure begins. I remember reading about biology later in my life. I was curious about it, but I didn't have the years of background that a professional biologist would have. So I'd read a paper, and I'd come across something like the Krebs cycle, and I'd think, do I really know what that is? So I'd stop and I'd get a piece of paper and I'd try to explain the Krebs cycle to myself. What is it? Why does it happen? What's the purpose? And I'd get stuck on some step. I didn't understand why this molecule becomes that molecule. So I'd look it up. I'd read more carefully. I'd draw it out. And gradually, piece by piece, I'd build up my understanding. The beautiful thing about this method is that it works for anything. Physics, mathematics, biology, history, philosophy, it doesn't matter. The principle is the same. Take an idea and explain it to yourself simply. Find the gaps. Fill them in. Build from solid ground. And here's something else I discovered. When you learn this way, you often find that the experts don't understand things as well as you thought. You find inconsistencies in their explanations. You find gaps in the standard way of teaching things. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes you find a better way to think about something, a clearer way, because you refuse to accept confusion. I'm not saying this to criticize experts. I'm saying it because it's liberating. You don't have to wait for someone else to explain things perfectly. You don't have to feel inadequate because a textbook confuses you. Sometimes the textbook is just poorly written. Sometimes even the experts are confused. Your job is to understand for yourself in your own way. Of course, you have to be honest with yourself, brutally honest. You can't fake understanding. When you try to explain something and you realize you're just using circular definitions or you're hand-waving over the hard parts, you have to stop and admit, I don't actually get this yet. That's okay. That's good, actually, because now you know what you need to work on. You've turned a vague feeling of confusion into a specific question, and specific questions can be answered. I think one reason many people struggle to learn new things as they get older is not because their minds are less capable, that's mostly nonsense, but because they become less willing to admit confusion. They have identities as knowledgeable people, as experts in their fields, and it's uncomfortable to feel like a beginner again, so they stay on familiar ground. But learning requires that beginner's mind. It requires being willing to say, I don't understand this yet, but I'm going to figure it out. No shame in that, no embarrassment, just curiosity and determination. When I was at Los Alamos, Hans Bethe was there, brilliant physicist, one of the best. And I noticed something about him. Whenever someone explained a new idea to him, he wouldn't just nod and accept it. He'd work through it himself, right there. often asking questions that seemed almost naive. Wait, why does that follow? I don't see how you got from this step to that step. But those naive questions often revealed that the person explaining hadn't really thought it through properly. Bet taught me that real understanding means being able to answer the simple question, the fundamental why question. If you can't answer those, you're building on sand. So here's what I learned, and what I've tried to practice throughout my life. Learning is not about accumulating information. It's not about being able to recite facts or manipulate symbols. Learning is about building a structure of understanding, brick by brick, where each brick is solid and you know why it's where it is. You start with what you understand clearly. You expand from there, always checking. Can I explain this simply? Does this make sense? When you hit something you can't explain simply, that's not a failure, that's a discovery. You found the edge of your understanding. Now you can work on extending it. And you know what happens when you learn this way? You become independent. You don't need to rely on authorities or textbooks or experts to tell you what's true. You can figure things out yourself. You develop judgment. You can tell when someone is explaining something clearly and when they're hiding behind jargon. You can tell when you really understand something and when you're fooling yourself. This independence of mind, that's the real value. Not just the specific things you learn, but the ability to learn anything. The confidence that comes from knowing you can take any subject, no matter how complex or unfamiliar, and gradually make sense of it. There's a freedom in this. You're not trapped by your past education or lack of it. You're not limited by what subjects you studied in school. If you want to understand something, really understand it, you can. It might take time. It might take effort. But it's possible. I've watched people talk themselves out of learning things because they think they're not good at math, or not a science person, or whatever story they've told themselves. But those are just stories. If you're willing to start simple, admit confusion, and work through things step by step, you can understand anything. I think about my father's lesson with the bird. All those fancy names in all those languages, they're easy to collect. You can fill your head with them. You can impress people at parties. But they're empty. Real knowledge is different. Real knowledge is understanding what the bird is doing and why. Real knowledge lets you make predictions, see connections, understand how things work. And the beautiful thing is, anyone can do this. You don't need to be specially gifted. You don't need advanced degrees. You just need curiosity, honesty, and patience. You need to be willing to start simple, to admit confusion, to work through things step by step. I've spent my whole life trying to understand things, and I'm still doing it. There's always more to learn, more to figure out. And every time I sit down with a piece of paper and try to explain something to myself, I'm using the same method I developed as a young man. It never gets old because understanding never gets old. The pleasure of figuring something out, of seeing clearly what was once murky, that never diminishes. So if there's a secret to learning anything fast, it's this. Don't try to go fast, try to go deep. Try to really understand. Explain it simply. Find the gaps, fill them in. Build on solid ground. The speed comes naturally when your foundation is strong. What looks like slow, careful work at the beginning becomes rapid progress later, because you're not constantly backtracking to fix misunderstandings or rememorizing things you never really grasped. And remember, the goal isn't to know more than other people, or to be clever, or to impress anyone. The goal is to see clearly, to understand truly. Everything else, the success, the recognition, the ability to solve difficult problems, that all comes as a byproduct of genuine understanding. Chase understanding, and the rest takes care of itself. That's what I learned anyway. And it served me pretty well.
Most people don't forget what they learned because they have a bad memory. They forget because they never truly learned it in the first place. Learning isn't about collecting information. It's about transforming knowledge into usable understanding. And here's what almost no one realizes. You don't retain what you merely read. You retain what you process. The human mind isn't a storage unit. It's a system of connections. The brain only keeps what turns into reasoning, action, or insight. That's why reading fast, watching videos at double speed, or writing everything down doesn't guarantee learning. The secret lies in what comes after. Between the moment you consume an idea and the moment it becomes part of who you are, there's a gap, and that's where real learning happens. The creator of this method calls it the balance between consumption and mental digestion. Consumption is when you absorb. Digestion is when you transform. One without the other is a waste of time. Most people live stuck in consumption, addicted to collecting content, but never creating an internal structure to retain it. The mind needs pauses. It needs synthesis. It needs application. Whatever you don't translate into action, your brain throws away as irrelevant. So the real question is, are you actually learning or just accumulating? The method you're about to discover, PACER, was designed precisely to solve this problem, to turn reading and studying into lasting retention, mental clarity, and real mastery. PACER is a mental map that transforms any information into permanent knowledge. It divides what you learn into 5 types of content, and each type requires a specific kind of processing. It's like having 5 doors in your mind, and each one opens with a different key. The first letter, P, stands for procedural, practical knowledge, the how to do it. It's learning that requires action, not reading. If you want to learn something skill-based, writing better, playing an instrument, speaking in public, the mind only records it when the body executes it. The command is simple: learn by doing, repeat, practice, make mistakes, adjust. The brain only marks something as important when there's movement and effort. The second letter, A, stands for analogous, knowledge through analogy. Here lies one of the most powerful mental tricks that exist. Every abstract idea needs a concrete image to last. The mind doesn't remember scattered phrases, it remembers vivid comparisons. So whenever you learn something new, create an analogy. Ask yourself, what does this resemble? Or, what image represents this in my mind? When you build your own analogies, you force the brain to connect the new with the familiar, and that connection is where learning becomes permanent. The third letter, C, stands for conceptual, the concepts, principles, and relationships between ideas. This is the kind of knowledge that defines the depth of your understanding. Memorizing is easy. Comprehension is rare. To master concepts, reading isn't enough. You have to map them. Build mental networks between ideas. Visualize content as a map, not a list. When the brain understands how the parts connect, it never forgets the whole. The fourth letter, E, stands for evidence, the proof behind an idea. Numbers, examples, experiments, data, facts. This type of information requires organization and review. The most common mistake is underestimating the power of revisiting. The brain forgets by default. It's not designed to store everything. That's why you must teach it what to keep. The process is simple. Store your notes in an accessible way. Use digital notebooks, flashcards, Notion, any tool, and return to them periodically. Spaced repetition is like oxygen for memory. Reviewing tells the brain, this matters, keep it. The fifth letter is R, for reference, quick access knowledge. These are the details you don't need to keep constantly in your head, but must have within reach. Dates, names, formulas, quotes. The mind works best when you don't overload your internal storage. The secret is to externalize. Build systems to find, not to memorize. Use flashcards, smart notes, or short index cards with spaced review. The goal isn't to know everything. It's to know where to find everything when you need it. And this is where the Packer method comes full circle. It's not a reading technique. It's a system of digestion. It teaches that every type of information must be processed differently because the brain doesn't treat everything the same way. Practical knowledge needs repetition. Conceptual knowledge needs structure. Evidence needs review. And reference knowledge needs systems. That's what separates people who read a lot and forget from those who read little and never forget. Here's the secret. Learning isn't about memorizing words. It's about reconstructing the thinking behind them. Understanding is power. When you truly understand, you don't need to force memory. It becomes a natural consequence of clarity. Most people try to store sentences but forget to store meaning. And meaning is what the brain recognizes as truth. Want to remember forever? Then stop trying to remember. Try to understand. Ask yourself, why does this work? How can I apply this today? What changes if I alter this part? These questions create mental roots. They connect theory to experience. And that bridge is what makes the brain record information deeply. The mind doesn't learn through mechanical repetition. It learns through engagement. Every time you question, explain, and reconstruct knowledge in your own words, you're literally shaping new neural connections. That's why the biggest mistake is studying as a spectator. You must become a participant in knowledge. The brain is an active system, not a passive one. It needs to build, not just consume. So when you finish studying something, close the book and explain it, even if it's to an empty room. Say out loud what you just learned, as if teaching someone else. And notice, the simpler you can explain it, the deeper your understanding truly is. Real learning happens when you can turn something complex into something clear, fluid, and natural. That's mastery. The mind doesn't want to be full. It wants to be clear. Now think about this. What if learning were an experiment? Not something to memorize, but something to discover. The mind loves to test, to play, to fail, to adjust, to try again. That's how it locks things in. When you turn learning into a mental laboratory, boredom disappears. You begin to engage with the process, to feel genuine curiosity. Don't study just to get it right. Study to understand what happens when you get it wrong. Every mistake is valuable information, a map showing what's still missing. And the more you test, the more your brain understands the pattern. That's how insight is born, that moment when everything suddenly clicks. The brain operates through experimentation, not obedience. So stop trying to learn like a machine and start learning like an explorer. Ask what if, why, how. Write hypotheses, draw possibilities, imagine scenarios. When you do this, you activate the mind's creative power, the same one the great thinkers used to understand the universe. Learning stops being an obligation and becomes living curiosity.
Here's the secret. You don't learn by repeating. You learn by recreating, by thinking, combining, altering, mixing ideas until knowledge becomes part of who you are. That's how you never forget, because what you create, the mind recognizes as yours. Everything in the universe is connected, and your mind learns through connection too. True learning happens when you see the bridges between ideas, when you realize that an economic principle can teach you something about human behavior, that a lesson in physics can explain life itself, that a concept in music can reveal how the brain creates harmony between reason and emotion. The mind doesn't work in isolated drawers. It functions like a living web. Every new piece of knowledge must link to something you already understand, and that link is what locks in learning. That's why mind maps work. They turn thought into visible structure, and the more connections you build, the stronger your memory network becomes. It's as if the brain says, "I've seen this before, but now I understand it from another angle." The secret isn't memorization, it's association. When reading something new, ask yourself, where does this fit into what I already know? And by answering, you turn information into wisdom. The mind loves patterns, and each time you find one, it builds a neural bridge. That's why some people learn with speed and depth. They don't collect data, they connect worlds. Learning isn't about stacking knowledge, it's about weaving meaning. The more connections you create, the more alive your intelligence becomes. There's a silent strength that separates great thinkers from the rest. The courage to say, "I don't know." Because only when you admit you don't know does your mind open to real learning. Pretending to know is like locking a door from the inside. Nothing new can enter. The mind that wants to appear smart is the same one that blocks its own growth. But the mind that embraces emptiness blooms.
When you accept that you don't understand something, you awaken the most powerful engine of learning, curiosity. It's what drives the brain to seek connections, test ideas, and rebuild understanding. The curious mind isn't satisfied with ready-made answers. It wants to know why, and it's in that process that learning becomes permanent. Mistakes aren't enemies, they're laboratories. Every doubt is a new neural path waiting to be formed. That's why true learners aren't afraid to look foolish. They're only afraid to stop questioning. The more you allow yourself not to know, the more space you create to discover. The mind that wants to understand everything instantly becomes shallow. The one that embraces uncertainty becomes deep. To know little, but deeply, is worth more than knowing much and understanding nothing. When you take on the role of a lifelong learner, the entire world becomes your classroom, and the joy of discovering becomes the fuel of your mind. Now listen closely. Here's the secret that turns learning into permanence. If you want to remember everything you learn, it's not enough to absorb. You must rebuild. Knowledge is like a muscle. It grows when you make it move. So every time you learn something new, turn it into simple words, as if you were teaching someone who knows nothing about it. When you do this, you force your mind to reorganize what it understood, and that's when knowledge solidifies. There is no real memorization without explanation. The mind remembers most intensely what it has to recreate. That's why those who teach learn the most. When you explain, your mind forges new connections, transforms data into ideas, and ideas into understanding. And each time you repeat this process, the brain says, "This matters. Keep this with me." Conscious repetition is the cement of learning. But here's the crucial part. Don't repeat mechanically. Repeat with purpose. Relive the emotion of what you learned. Visualize it, connect it, question it, and above all, apply it. Knowledge that isn't used is knowledge that fades. You want to remember? Use what you've learned. Talk about it. Write about it. Test it in real life. The mind understands this. What you use, it keeps. What you ignore, it erases. Forgetting isn't failure. It's filtering. The brain is far too intelligent to store what you don't value. So show it what matters. Practice, share, connect. With each application, knowledge stops being mere information and becomes part of who you are. Now listen carefully, because this is where everything comes together. Learning isn't about accumulation, it's about transformation. True mastery begins when what you know starts changing how you live, when knowledge stops being something you carry and becomes something that guides you. Remember, the mind is fertile ground, but it only blooms when you nurture what you plant. Every idea you understand, every concept you apply, every repetition you do with intention is a seed being watered by awareness. And the result doesn't come by magic. It comes by consistency. The difference between those who forget and those who master is one simple decision: to keep practicing, even when it feels like you already know. Because real learning isn't linear, it's spiral. You return to the same point, but at a deeper level. So the next time you learn something, don't ask, "How can I memorize this?" Ask, "How can I live this?" Because what you live, you never forget. When knowledge becomes action, the brain recognizes it as part of your being. And that's how you remember everything. Not by force, but by identity. You become what you understand, and you understand what you practice. And if you ever doubt yourself, return to the essentials. Simplify, explain, question, apply. That's the cycle. That's the secret to remembering everything you read forever. If this video awakens something inside you, then now is the time to act. Write this in the comments. Today, I reprogram my mind to never forget what I learned. Write it as a command, as a mental affirmation. Because when you write, the brain recognizes it as a decision and begins to work in your favor. Leave your like right now, because that's how you tell YouTube you want more content that expands your awareness. And if you're not yet subscribed, subscribe now. Here, every video is another step in your awakening. Here, you'll learn to master your mind, remember everything you read, and turn knowledge into real power. Your new level of awareness begins now. You've probably been learning the wrong way your entire life. Since we were children, we've been conditioned to believe that the more we study, the smarter we become. But what if I told you that this is the biggest mistake in modern education? That in fact, the more you study, the less you truly understand. The human mind has a strange flaw. It confuses repetition with understanding. You read something 10 times, listen to someone explain it, repeat the words, and you feel like you get it. But the moment someone asks you to explain it out loud, it vanishes like smoke. The truth is, learning isn't about filling your head with information. Learning is about rebuilding reality inside your mind. And that only happens when you try to explain something in your own words and realize you can't. That's the moment your brain wakes up. Most people run away from that discomfort. They prefer the illusion of knowing rather than the pain of realizing they don't. But those who truly learn, they face the confusion. They start piecing the puzzle together one thought at a time. And here's the secret. The fastest way to learn anything is to stop trying to learn fast. Because real learning isn't about speed, it's about depth. When you learn slowly, each idea has time to sink in. That's the art of giving your mind the exact time it needs to become brilliant. But the mind has a tragic flaw. It believes that thinking about something is the same as learning it. That's why so many people live trapped in a quiet cycle. They study, memorize, collect theories, yet stay exactly the same. Pay attention. Your brain has a limited amount of conscious energy. Each new idea, each rule, each formula takes up a small part of that mental space. Now picture your brain as a drain. Yes, a drain, where knowledge must flow through before it turns into understanding. When the flow is light, it works perfectly. You pour in one idea at a time, the water runs smoothly, and what settles at the bottom is clear, stable understanding.
But if you pour everything at once, dozens of theories, formulas, videos, techniques, the drain starts to clog. The water can't go down. It builds up, overflows, and you drown in the excess. That's exactly how the brain reacts to theoretical overload. It tries to process everything, but it can't turn raw information into structure. And when the mind doesn't have time to organize what it received, it starts shutting down. You feel tired, foggy, forgetful. It's not stupidity. It's a mental traffic jam. Learning is movement, a dance between input and output. You receive an idea, reflect on it, practice, test, fail, and then finally, you understand. That cycle is what keeps the drain clean. But most people stay stuck at the input stage. They consume video after video, book after book, class after class, and never let the mind breathe. The brain needs pauses to connect what it's learned. Without those pauses, nothing sticks. It's like trying to pour an ocean into a glass. No matter how much you add, it always overflows. So here's the truth no one told you. You don't need to learn more. You need to learn with more space. The secret isn't in collecting more theory. It's in allowing understanding to form. It's in silence that the brain organizes. It's in practice that it solidifies. And it's in simplicity that it finally understands. Imagine someone trying to learn guitar. They watch 10 tutorials, memorize the chords, study scales, read about harmony, but never play. Then one day they finally pick up the instrument and nothing works. Their fingers freeze, the sound feels wrong, the rhythm breaks. And they think, why is this so hard? I studied so much. The answer is simple. They confused information with practice. The theory was in the mind, but the body, the system, never lived the experience.
Real learning doesn't happen when you understand something. It happens when you test what you understand. And it's in that test that the mind begins to reshape itself. Here's how it works. You do something, you observe the result, and before moving on, you ask yourself, what should I change to make it better? That single question separates the curious from the wise. It's what turns study into experimentation. And every time you go through that cycle, action, reflection, adjustment, your brain refines itself. It builds new pathways, deletes useless ones, and turns trial into mastery. That's what I call the experiential cycle. And without it, there is no growth. You can read 1,000 books about swimming, but you'll still drown if you never get into the water. Because the body needs to feel what the mind only imagines. Learning something new is like aiming at an invisible target. You take a shot, see where it lands, adjust your aim, and try again. Each attempt brings you closer to the center. But if you only think about shooting, you never hit anything. True learning isn't linear. It's an endless cycle between doing and understanding. Without doing, knowledge decays. Without understanding, action becomes repetition. The balance between the two is what shapes a mind capable of eternal growth. What confuses most people is the belief that understanding something means making it complicated. But the truth is the opposite. Simplicity is the ultimate proof of understanding. Think about it. When you really understand something, you don't need fancy words or complex sentences. You can explain it so clearly that even a child would understand. That doesn't diminish knowledge. It elevates it to its purest form. The human mind loves to hide ignorance behind complicated language. It's an elegant defense against inner confusion. But the wise do the opposite. They take what's complex, break it apart, understand each piece, and rebuild it into something light. And when they speak, it sounds easy. But that's exactly what makes it genius. Imagine someone trying to understand the universe. They study formulas, read equations, watch lectures, but nothing truly clicks. Until one day, they grab a sheet of paper and try to explain it. Without notes, without reading, just from memory. Suddenly, they can't. Their mind freezes. Their logic,
collapses. And in that moment, something beautiful happened. Confusion reveals where learning stopped. The secret is this: don't fight confusion, investigate it. Every part you can't explain is a doorway to the understanding you still lack. And when you walk through that doorway, something magical happens. The complex becomes simple, and the simple becomes profound. Because when you explain something with clarity, the brain organizes. When it organizes, it understands. And when it understands, it never forgets. Learning isn't about memorizing answers. It's about creating a map inside your mind, a path so well drawn that you can walk it with your eyes closed. And there's only one way to draw that map: by rebuilding knowledge in your own words. Not the words of a book, yours. True learning doesn't happen when you understand something. It happens when you can teach what you've understood, effortlessly, naturally, without notes. That's the moment when knowledge stops being information and becomes part of who you are. There comes a moment when the mind, tired of trying to sound intelligent, simply understands. No more effort, no more noise. The confusion dissolves, and everything suddenly feels obvious, as if the knowledge had always been there, waiting for you to clear away the excess. That is the moment of clarity, and it's more powerful than any degree, technique, or title. When you reach clarity, learning stops feeling like a burden. It becomes natural, like breathing. You no longer have to force your brain to remember, because what is clear never fades. The mind stops fighting the content and starts playing with it. And in that state of lightness, true genius is born. Think of someone who works with purpose. They don't look like they're studying, they're just doing. But behind the simplicity of their action lies a deep understanding. That's the difference between the student who repeats and the one who creates. The difference between the noise of knowing and the silence of mastery. Clarity is a form of freedom. When you understand the essential, the unnecessary loses its power. You stop chasing 1,000 techniques and start walking confidently in one direction. And that direction changes everything, because focus is the opposite of chaos. And focus is born from simplicity. The ordinary mind gets lost trying to learn everything. The wise mind chooses what truly matters. And that choice transforms not just learning, but existence itself. When you truly understand, the world slows down. The noise around you fades. You no longer feel small in front of complexity because you've learned to see the structure behind the chaos. In that moment, the mind stops being a labyrinth and becomes a window. Everything that once felt complicated becomes simple. And everything that once felt distant becomes reachable. Learning stops being effort, it becomes a state. You start to see patterns, connections, ideas. Creativity appears, not as effort, but as a natural consequence. Because when the mind is organized, life organizes itself too. In the end, it all comes down to one simple truth. Learning for the sake of learning is a waste of time. Because knowledge that never becomes action dies inside the mind. You don't need to study more, you need to study better. The human mind isn't a warehouse of theories. It's a living system. And like any system, it needs balance. If you try to pour everything in at once, 1,000 ideas, methods, formulas, concepts, it collapses. Think of your brain as a drain. When the water flows gently, it runs clear and leaves understanding at the bottom. But if you pour everything in all at once, the drain clogs. The water rises, chaos begins, and learning turns into stress, confusion, and forgetfulness. Learning isn't about running, it's about flowing. You have to give each idea time to find its place. Let the experience settle. Let silence organize it. And let practice solidify what theory only touched. That's why learning slowly is, in truth, the fastest way to learn. Because only what's built with care endures. The ideal way to learn is cyclical, not linear. You act, you observe the result, you ask yourself, what should I change? And you return to the experiment. That is the cycle of experience, the process that turns trial into mastery. Because every practice is a mirror. It shows you what works, what doesn't, and above all, what you still don't understand. And when you teach what you've just learned, something extraordinary happens. The brain reorganizes itself. Explaining forces the mind to simplify, and simplification is the essence of real understanding. You realize that knowledge isn't something you own.
It's something you rebuild every time you share it. So remember, the secret isn't to learn faster, but to learn consciously, to learn less but with greater depth, to practice, reflect, and adjust, to keep the drain clear, the flow free, and the mind light enough to understand the world, one idea at a time. Successful people think differently because they're not worried about other people's judgment. While the world criticizes, they create. While most people are busy protecting their reputation, they're too busy searching for the truth. And here's the key. Thinking differently is not an aesthetic choice. It's an intellectual survival skill. If you think like everyone else, you'll end up with the same results as everyone else. And the average is harsh. Uninspiring jobs, lives with no purpose, routines where people wake up, work, complain, and go to sleep. Nothing more. Is that really living? Or is it just surviving? Pay close attention now, because this may change the course of your life. Think differently, or die average. Stop believing what everyone else believes. Stop repeating what everyone else says. Every success story begins with someone who dared to disagree with normality. Not because they wanted to look rebellious, but because curiosity was stronger than the fear of judgment. And it's this curiosity, directed and disciplined, that opens doors the average will never see. So think differently. And if you decide to think differently, prepare yourself for something greater. The freedom to learn anything, to create paths no one has created, to master your own mind. Listen carefully now, because what I'm about to reveal lies behind every genius mind: curiosity. Ordinary people lose curiosity over time. They accept ready-made answers, stop asking questions, stop investigating. They think they already know enough. And that's the moment mediocrity sets in. Now look at the people who truly stood out. Scientists, entrepreneurs, creative leaders. They all had one thing in common. They never stopped asking questions. Even if they didn't understand something, they would ask again and again and again until the answer finally made sense in their mind. This is the first step to thinking differently. Many people are embarrassed to raise their hand and say, "I don't understand," afraid of being criticized. In a classroom, the student who asks too many questions is easily labeled as stupid. But the truth is exactly the opposite. The one who asks questions is one step ahead. The one who questions shows the courage to learn. That's why, if you want to start thinking differently, begin with the simple act of admitting your doubt. The courage to ask is the mark of someone who refuses to remain ordinary. Now pay attention to me, because I'll show you how to truly think differently. Thinking differently is a daily exercise in intellectual freedom. The first step is to do what you love. When you work or study something that sparks passion, your energy multiplies. Normal is waking up tired because you spend energy on activities that don't inspire you. Different is waking up hungry for life because you're investing your time in what makes sense. Ask yourself, if nobody judged me, what would I choose to learn, to create, or to build? That answer points to your true path. Second, protect your mental independence. That means not letting other people's opinions become the filter for what you think or do. Most people fear being criticized, fear being called strange. But remember, everyone who changed the world was ridiculed before they were applauded. Thinking differently always bothers people because it exposes the mediocrity of those who follow the herd. Third, feed your curiosity without fear. Ask, test, explore. That's the fuel of innovation. Don't accept anything just because everyone does it this way. Ask yourself, is there another way? The simple act of questioning already puts you on another level. Fourth, simplify your life to free up energy for the essential. Those who think like everyone else get lost in excess. Those who think differently focus on what matters. If you're exhausted, it's hard to have the clarity to think in a new way. Energy is born from being aligned with purpose, eliminating the unnecessary, and putting strength into what truly moves your life. Pay close attention now, because what I'm about to tell you is one of the mind's biggest prisons, the fear of being different. Most people don't live their own ideas. They live other people's ideas. They're shaped by the opinions of family, friends, society, the media. They spend life trying to please, to fit in, to be accepted. But those who think differently understand something simple. If you always seek approval, you'll never have clarity. To think differently, you must learn to shield your mind against the pressure of the majority. And that starts with a daily exercise. Every time you feel tempted to do something just because everyone does it, stop and ask, does this really make sense to me? Does it bring me closer to what I want? Or does it just make me like everyone else? That simple question is enough to expose the automatic choices that keep you stuck in the average. Remember, life is too short to live dependent on other people's approval. Another point, choose carefully the voices you listen to. I'm not saying ignore everything and everyone, but be discerning. Ask yourself, does this person have results I admire? Do they live what they preach? Or do they just repeat what they've heard? If not, why give their opinion so much weight? Learn to separate constructive criticism from noise. And here's a powerful detail. The courage to stand by your own vision earns respect, even from those who disagree. At first, you may be criticized. You may even be ridiculed. But over time, when results appear, the same people who laughed at you go quiet. Nothing is more convincing than the evidence of a life lived with purpose and authenticity. Thinking differently is swimming against the current. It's bearing the pressure of judgment without giving in. It's choosing the clarity of your conscience over the empty applause of the crowd. And when you train yourself in this, you realize that freedom isn't being accepted. It's living true to what you believe, even if no one claps. Thinking differently isn't an inborn talent. It's a trained habit. You're not born outside the box. You build the box and then learn to break it every day. That takes discipline. And discipline is born from rituals. If you want to stand out, you need to turn curiosity and mental independence into concrete actions that shape how you think. The first ritual is the daily question. Pick any situation in your life and ask, why is this done this way? Don't accept the first answer. Go deeper. Who said it has to be like this? Is there a better, simpler, faster way to do it? When repeated every day, this exercise trains your mind not to settle for ready-made answers. The second ritual is explaining out loud. When you learn something new, don't keep it to yourself. Explain it. Even if it's to the mirror, when you speak, your mind organizes, your ideas align, and the gaps show up. That's the moment you discover if you truly understood. This simple habit will accelerate your ability to learn 10 times more than someone who only reads and repeats. The third ritual is creative review. At the end of the day, take one idea or important concept you learned and recreate it in your own words. Use a metaphor, a story, an example from your life. This act of recreation makes the idea stop being external and become part of you. It's in this act that different thinking begins to flourish. And finally, the ritual of conscious observation. Set aside a few minutes to observe something ordinary and ask yourself, what is no one else seeing here? It could be an object, a situation, even a conversation. This practice trains your eyes to see beyond the obvious. That's how innovations are born, from someone who looked at the ordinary and saw the extraordinary. Those who practice these rituals don't just think differently, they begin to live on another level of perception. And that difference builds up day after day until it becomes an advantage impossible to ignore. But here's the truth. The path of those who think differently is never easy. They are misunderstood, judged, often humiliated. The crowd cannot stand those who break the pattern, because independent thinking exposes the mediocrity of those who prefer to follow the herd. It's easier to call someone crazy than to admit they might have seen something you didn't. But listen, every great person you admire went through this. Galileo was condemned for seeing beyond what the church accepted. Bruce Lee was ridiculed for mixing styles and creating his own philosophy. All of them were seen as too different until the world had to bow to the evidence of what they built. And here's the secret few have the courage to accept. Thinking differently is expensive in the beginning, but it pays dividends forever. The rejection you feel today is the same energy that will fuel your victory tomorrow. This is the path of those who refuse to die average. They choose truth over acceptance, curiosity over indifference, courage over fear. And with that, they build something that lasts, something that inspires, something that cannot be erased. So I tell you, if you want to think differently, be prepared to be misunderstood, be ready to be criticized, but also be certain that in the end you will be remembered. Because no one remembers the crowd that merely repeated. History remembers the names of those who dared to be unique. Think differently, protect your flame, and never bow to mediocrity. Because in the end, you either have the courage to live as an exception, or you accept dying as just another in the average. Now it's on you. I want you to prove to yourself that you've chosen to think differently. Write in the comments, "I will never accept dying being influenced." This phrase is more than words. It's a pact with your mind, a declaration that you will not bow to mediocrity. And if you enjoyed this lesson, leave your like. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell, because here you'll keep receiving ideas that will challenge your mind, expand your vision, and accelerate your learning. Remember, those who think like the majority live like the majority, but those who choose to think differently create a destiny the crowd could never imagine.